When 8-year-old Whitney Houston asked her family for the chance to audition for the church solo that Sunday, everyone in the room thought she was dreaming too big. What happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest voice carries the most powerful truth. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss more amazing stories about the childhood moments that shape music's greatest legends. March 18th, 1972. The Houston family home on Dodd Street in Newark, New Jersey was nothing fancy, but it was filled with something more valuable than money: pure, undeniable musical talent. 3 bedrooms for 6 people, 1 bathroom, and a living room that doubled as the family's rehearsal space. The carpet was worn thin from years of practicing, and the walls were so thin you could hear every note from every room. But that modest house was about to witness something that would change music history forever. Whitney was the baby of the family at 8 years old, the youngest of Cissy Houston's children. Her older brothers Gary and Michael had been singing in church for years, commanding attention with their strong, trained voices. Gary, in particular, was known throughout Newark's gospel community as the Houston family's rising star. At 14, he could hit notes that made grown women shout "Hallelujah" in the middle of service. The Houston family wasn't just any family in Newark's music scene. Cissy Houston was an established backup singer who had worked with legends like Elvis Presley and Aretha Franklin. Their cousin Dionne Warwick was already making waves in the music industry. When the Houstons walked into New Hope Baptist Church every Sunday, people noticed. They were gospel royalty, and everyone knew it. But young Whitney, she was always in the background, harmonizing quietly, learning by watching. Too small, too young, too inexperienced to handle the big solos that her brothers performed with such confidence. That was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. On this particular Sunday evening, the family had gathered in their living room for their weekly practice session. Tomorrow was Sunday service, and Gary was scheduled to perform the lead on "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," one of the most challenging hymns in their church's repertoire. It was a song that required not just vocal power, but emotional depth and spiritual connection. Gary had been practicing for weeks. His voice was strong, his technique was solid, and everyone expected another flawless performance from the Houston family's golden boy. But as Gary finished his final run-through, something unexpected happened. "Mama," Whitney said quietly from her spot on the worn carpet where she'd been listening, "can I try?" The room fell silent. Gary stopped mid-note. Michael looked up from his sheet music. Cissy Houston, who had been nodding along to Gary's performance, turned to look at her youngest daughter. "Try what, baby?" Cissy asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew what Whitney meant. "The solo. Can I audition for the solo?" Gary actually laughed. Not mean laughter, but the kind of laugh that says, "Oh, that's cute." It was the laugh of an older brother who loved his little sister, but knew she was reaching for something way beyond her grasp. "Whitney, honey," Gary said gently, "that's a really hard song. I've been practicing it for months. Maybe next year, when you're a little older." "I know the song," Whitney interrupted, her voice small but surprisingly steady. "I know all the words. I know the melody. I've been listening to you practice." Michael exchanged a look with Gary. Their little sister was persistent. They'd give her that, but persistence wasn't the same as ability. "Whitney," Cissy said carefully, "that solo requires a lot of vocal control. It's not just about knowing the words. You have to have the breath support, the range, the spiritual connection." "I can do it," Whitney said, and for the first time her voice wasn't small. It was determined. "I'm ready." Cissy Houston studied her youngest daughter carefully. At 8 years old, Whitney barely came up to her mother's waist. She was all legs and arms and big eyes, still losing baby teeth. The idea of her handling a solo that challenged even experienced adult singers seemed impossible. But there was something in Whitney's eyes that gave Cissy pause, a certainty that seemed too mature for her age. "Maybe we should wait," Cissy finally said. "Whitney's still young. There's time." "No." Everyone looked at Whitney. She had never interrupted her mother before. Ever. "I can do it," Whitney repeated, standing up from the carpet. "I'm ready. Just let me show you." The living room was thick with tension. Gary was the one who got the solos. Gary was the one everyone came to hear. Gary was the Houston family's church star. And now 8-year-old Whitney was challenging that entire dynamic. Cissy leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd heard Whitney humming along to their practice sessions for years. She'd noticed how perfectly Whitney could harmonize without even thinking about it. She'd seen how Whitney's eyes lit up during church services when the music got particularly powerful. But knowing a song and performing a song were two entirely different things. "All right," Cissy finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "Show us what you got, baby." What happened next would change the Houston family's understanding of talent in ways no one could have predicted. Whitney walked to the center of the small living room. Without any accompaniment, without any warm-up, without any of the preparation rituals that Gary always went through before performing, she simply stood there. She looked even smaller standing alone in the middle of the room. Her bare feet looked tiny against the worn carpet. Her white cotton dress was simple, almost childlike. Her hair was pulled back in two neat braids that Cissy had done that morning. But when Whitney opened her mouth to sing, everything changed. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah." The voice that came out of Whitney Houston's 8-year-old body was impossible. It wasn't the cute, earnest singing of a child trying her best. This wasn't a little girl playing dress-up with adult songs. This was something else entirely. The note was perfect. Crystal clear, pure. But more than that, there was something in Whitney's voice that you couldn't teach, couldn't fake, couldn't manufacture. There was soul. Gary's mouth dropped open. He had been singing that same song for months, and he had never made it sound like that. "Pilgrim through this barren land." Whitney's voice got stronger, more confident. She wasn't just singing the words, she was feeling them. An 8-year-old child was conveying spiritual longing and faith and hope in a way that made the adults in the room feel something stirring in their hearts. Cissy Houston had heard thousands of singers in her professional career. She had worked with some of the greatest voices in music history. She knew talent when she heard it. This was beyond talent. This was a gift. "I am weak, but thou art mighty." Whitney's eyes were closed now, completely lost in the music. She wasn't performing for her family anymore. She was singing to something higher, something spiritual. The song was pouring out of her like it had been waiting inside her whole life. Michael had stopped breathing. He had never heard anything like this. "Hold me with thy powerful hand." The living room seemed to shrink around Whitney's voice. The modest furniture, the worn carpet, the cramped space, none of it mattered. Whitney's voice filled every corner, every crevice, transforming their simple home into something sacred. Gary realized his hands were shaking. His little sister, the baby of the family, was singing better than he ever had in his life. Better than he ever would. The song built to its climax. This was the part where most singers struggled, where the notes got demanding, and you needed both power and perfect control. "Bread of heaven, bread of heaven." Whitney's voice soared. She wasn't straining. She wasn't forcing it. The note came out like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she had been born to sing this exact song at this exact moment. "Feed me till I want no more." The final phrase, the money moment, the part where you either nailed it or fell apart completely. Whitney opened her eyes and looked directly at her mother as she sang the last line. "Feed me till I want no more." The final note hung in the air. Perfect, pure, impossible. Then silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. Then Gary Houston, the brother who was supposed to sing that solo tomorrow, who had been practicing for months, who was known as the family's star performer, started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Then Michael joined in. Then Cissy. But the applause quickly turned into something else. Gary was crying. Actually crying. "Whitney," he said, his voice thick with emotion. How did you, where did that come from?" Whitney looked confused. Had she done something wrong? "Did I mess up?" "Mess up?" Cissy Houston stood up from her chair and walked over to her youngest daughter. "Baby, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "Really? Really?" Cissy knelt down to Whitney's level, tears streaming down her face. "Whitney, honey, do you understand what just happened? You just sang that song better than I've heard it sung in 20 years of church music." Whitney didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. "Can I do the solo tomorrow?" she asked quietly. Gary answered before his mother could. "Whitney, that solo is yours." I couldn't follow that if I tried. But Cissy was thinking bigger than just Sunday service. What she had just witnessed wasn't just good singing. It wasn't even just great singing. This was something that came along maybe once in a generation. "Whitney," Cissy said carefully, "how long have you been able to sing like that?" Whitney thought about it. "I don't know. Always, I guess. I hear the songs in my head, and then I just sing them the way they sound in there." "The way they sound in your head?" "Yeah, like when Gary sings, it sounds good. But in my head, it sounds different. More, more like something." Cissy exchanged a look with her older sons. They all understood what Whitney was trying to say, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. "Whitney," Michael said gently, "why didn't you ever sing like that before? Why didn't you tell us you could do that?" Whitney shrugged. "Nobody ever asked me. Gary always got the solos. I thought I was supposed to just listen and learn." That was the moment Cissy Houston realized that everything was about to change. Not just for Whitney, but for their entire family. The next morning at New Hope Baptist Church, word had spread quickly through the congregation. The Houston family's youngest was going to perform the solo. People were curious, but not necessarily expecting anything extraordinary. Whitney was just a little Houston girl. Sweet kid, but she was no Gary. When Whitney walked to the front of the sanctuary, she looked even smaller than she had in the living room the night before. The church was packed, and she was wearing a simple blue dress that Cissy had pressed that morning. Her hair was in the same neat braids, but when Reverend Patterson nodded for her to begin, and Whitney opened her mouth to sing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," the entire church forgot how to breathe. The voice that filled New Hope Baptist Church that Sunday morning was the same impossible, pure, soul-stirring voice that had shocked her family the night before. But now it had an audience of 200 people, and the effect was electric. By the end of the first verse, the congregation was completely silent, transfixed. By the chorus, people were standing up. By the final note, the entire church erupted in applause and shouts of "Hallelujah!" that lasted for 5 full minutes. In the third pew, Cissy Houston sat with tears streaming down her face, watching her baby girl receive a standing ovation from a congregation that had just witnessed something miraculous. A local gospel music promoter named Luther Jackson was in the congregation that morning. After the service, he approached Cissy Houston. "Mrs. Houston," he said, "I've been in the gospel music business for 30 years. That child is going to be one of the greatest voices in music history. Mark my words." Cissy Houston didn't disagree. The performance in the Houston family living room on March 18, 1972 lasted less than 4 minutes. But those 4 minutes changed everything. Whitney Houston went from being the little one to being recognized as the voice that would carry the Houston musical legacy forward. Within a year, she was singing regularly at church and local gospel events. Within 5 years, she was singing backup for her mother's professional recording sessions. Within 10 years, she would sign her first record deal. Within 15 years, she would be known around the world as The Voice. But it all started in that tiny living room in Newark, New Jersey. It started with an 8-year-old girl who was brave enough to ask for a chance, brave enough to stand barefoot on a worn carpet in front of her family and risk everything, brave enough to show the world that sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest gift. Years later, in an interview, Gary Houston was asked about when he first realized Whitney was going to be a superstar. "March 18, 1972, Gary said without hesitation, "the day she sang 'Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah' in our living room. That was the day I knew I was living with someone unprecedented, someone who was going to change music forever." "Were you jealous?" the interviewer asked. Gary thought about it for a moment. "At first, maybe. But then I realized something incredible. I was watching history happen. How many people can say that? I got to witness the moment a legend was born. That's pretty special." He was right. That Sunday evening in March, in a house filled with music and faith, 8-year-old Whitney Houston proved that talent has no age limit, that courage isn't about being fearless, but about being terrified and performing anyway. and that sometimes the smallest voice carries the truest song. The little girl who stood barefoot in her family's living room would grow up to have one of the most celebrated voices in music history. But in that moment, she was just Whitney, scared, hopeful, and absolutely extraordinary. If this incredible story of young talent and family support inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more amazing stories about the moments that shaped music's greatest legends. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who doubted you? Let us know in the comments below.